I didn't get kicked out of my sister's wedding. I was erased while standing in the room. No shouting, no scene, just a chair moved, a name missing, a family deciding I didn't belong. Years later, when everything fell apart for them, they remembered exactly who I was. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I didn't think a wedding could feel like a funeral until I lived through my sister's. The venue was bright, white flowers everywhere, the kind of soft music that's supposed to make you feel hopeful. I remember arriving early because that's what I always did with family events. Show up early, help out, stay out of the way. I wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I told myself it was my sister's day, not mine, and that being there was enough. At first, everything felt normal. People smiled in that distracted way people do at weddings. Someone handed me a program and I scanned it without thinking. That was the first moment my stomach tightened. My sister's name was there, of course. My parents were listed, beaming and proud. Even distant relatives had their names printed neatly. Mine wasn't there. I told myself it was a mistake. Programs get rushed, names get missed. It didn't mean anything. Or at least that's what I told myself as I took my seat. Or rather, the seat I thought was mine. I had been told I'd be sitting near the front with family. When I reached the row, a wedding coordinator touched my arm lightly and said, "I'm sorry, sir, your seat has been moved." She said it kindly, like she was apologizing for the weather. She pointed toward the back, near people I didn't recognize. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I didn't argue, I didn't ask why, just nodded and walked, feeling every step echo louder than the music. From the back, I watched my family settle into their places. My parents didn't look at me. My sister didn't look at me. When the ceremony began, the officiants spoke about family, about love, about standing together. Each word landed like a quiet insult. During the vows, I clapped when everyone clapped. I smiled when everyone smiled. I kept telling myself that being invisible was better than causing a scene. After the ceremony, there was a moment when the photographer called for family photos. "Immediate family only," he said. My parents stepped forward. My sister and her new husband stepped forward. Cousins shuffled in. I stood instinctively because I had always stood for family photos. My mother glanced at me then just for a second and shook her head almost imperceptibly. No words, no explanation, just a small, final motion that told me to sit back down. I sat. I remember the feeling vividly, like something inside my chest folded in on itself. People walked past me, chatting, laughing, carrying glasses of champagne. No one asked why I wasn't in the photos. No one seemed to notice. At the reception, there were speeches. My father spoke about pride and sacrifice. My sister thanked everyone who supported her every step of the way. Names were mentioned, stories were told. Mine never came up. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, careful, clean. They hadn't thrown me out. They had simply edited me out. I stayed until the cake was cut. I hugged my sister because it was expected. She hugged me back politely, like you hug a coworker you barely know. When I left, no one stopped me. The drive home was quiet. I don't remember the music on the radio. I remember thinking about how silence can be louder than anger. Over the next weeks, I waited for someone to explain. A call from my parents, a message from my sister, anything that would tell me I hadn't imagined it. Nothing came. When I finally asked, carefully, gently, my mother said, "We thought it would be better this way." Better for whom, she didn't say. That was the day I understood I had been disowned without paperwork, without confrontation, just a quiet decision made without me. I didn't cut them off immediately. I tried for a while to keep showing up. Holidays became awkward. Invitations stopped coming. When I did show up, conversation stayed shallow. I was present but unwanted, like a piece of furniture no one remembered buying. Eventually, I stopped calling. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. It takes energy to beg silently for a place at a table that keeps shrinking. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It was slow. A missed birthday, a holiday spent alone, a realization that my phone was always quiet. In the years that followed, I built a life that didn't include them. I moved cities, I worked harder than I ever had, partly because work gave me something family hadn't: acknowledgement. I learned how to be alone without feeling abandoned, or at least I learned how to pretend. There were nights when the quiet felt heavy, when I wondered if I had overreacted, if being erased was somehow my fault. But time has a way of sharpening memories. The more distance I gained, the clearer that wedding became. The moved chair, the missing name, the small shake of my mother's head. I wasn't confused anymore. I was resolved. And that's when life decided to test that resolution. Years later, after I had finally stopped expecting anything from them, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. It was my father. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. His voice sounded older, tired. He asked how I was, as if we were catching up after a short break instead of years of silence. Then he said, "We need to talk." In that moment, I understood something before he explained it. Families don't reach out after erasing you unless something has gone wrong. When my father said they needed to talk, he didn't explain why. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the years that had passed like an empty hallway between us. He just said my name the way he used to when I was a child and had done something wrong, but not unforgivable. That tone alone told me more than words could. We agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between where I lived now and the house I grew up in. Neutral ground. That felt intentional, too. I arrived early, out of habit, and chose a table near the window. As I waited, I studied my reflection in the glass. I looked older, harder maybe, but steadier. I wondered what version of me they expected to see, the one who still waited for approval, or the one who learned how to live without it. When my parents walked in, they hesitated, scanning the room, until my mother spotted me. Her smile flickered, uncertain. My father's shoulders sagged as if the simple act of seeing me cost him something. We sat. Small talk came first. Weather, traffic, my job. They nodded politely like distant relatives catching up at a reunion. Then my father cleared his throat and said my sister's name. Immediately my chest tightened. He told me she was sick, very sick. Medical bills had piled up. Insurance wasn't enough. Her husband's business had failed and their savings were gone. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand, something she hadn't done in years. "We didn't know who else to ask," she said. That sentence hung between us, heavy and revealing. Not, "we were wrong," not, "we're sorry," just that they had run out of options. I listened quietly as they explained the situation, my mind drifting back to that wedding, to the way my chair had been moved without discussion. I noticed how carefully they spoke now, how gentle, as if afraid I might disappear again if they pressed too hard. When they finally stopped talking, there was a long pause. My father looked at me with something close to hope. That was the moment I realized the power had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, just subtly, like weight moving from one side of a scale to the other. I asked questions. How long had this been going on? What exactly did they need? They answered, relief creeping into their voices. They assumed, I think, that my presence meant compliance, that blood, once acknowledged, would automatically bind me again. But as they spoke, I felt strangely calm. There was no anger rising, no urge to lash out, just clarity. I told them I needed time to think. My mother's face fell. "Of course," she said, though disappointment colored every syllable. We stood to leave, and for a brief second my father looked like he wanted to hug me. He didn't. Old habits die hard. On the drive home, I thought about everything I had built without them. The late nights, the sacrifices, the quiet pride of standing on my own. I thought about the cost of reopening a door that had been closed for good reason. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Memories surfaced uninvited. Childhood moments when I had felt included, loved. They existed, and that made everything harder. The next day, my sister called. Hearing her voice after so long was disorienting. She sounded fragile, subdued. She didn't mention the wedding. She didn't apologize. She thanked me for meeting with our parents and said she hoped I could help. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about whether I would step back into a role they had taken away from me without consent. Over the following weeks, the calls continued. Subtle pressure, gentle reminders, stories of hardship. I noticed how no one asked how I felt about being excluded all those years ago. It was as if that chapter had been quietly erased, just like my name in the program. I met with a financial advisor. I ran numbers. I could help them. It wouldn't ruin me. But every calculation felt incomplete because it ignored the emotional cost. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment and imagined two futures. In one, I helped. I wrote the check. I became the dependable child again, quietly accepted back without acknowledgement of the harm done. In the other, I didn't. I stayed silent, firm, and alone. Neither option felt entirely right. That's when I understood something important. Forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger. Sometimes it's about deciding what you are willing to carry forward. I invited my parents and my sister to meet me, this time at my place. When they arrived, they looked around with polite interest, noticing the life I had built without them. We sat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply told them how that wedding felt. The moved chair, the missing name, the quiet instruction to sit down. I told them how being erased hurts more than being rejected openly. They listened. My mother cried. My sister stared at the floor. My father looked smaller than I remembered. When I finished, I said I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. I told them I couldn't help unless there was honesty and accountability, not just need. Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence I used to fear. Now, I let it sit. No one spoke for a long moment after I finished. The air in my living room felt thick, like it was pressing against my chest. My mother was the first to move. She wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve, a habit from when she didn't want to appear emotional in public. She said my name softly, the way she used to when she wanted me to understand something difficult. She told me they never meant to hurt me, that the wedding had been complicated, that my sister had been under stress and they were trying to keep the peace. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how carefully she avoided saying the words, "I'm sorry." My sister finally looked up. Her eyes were red, but there was a distance there, as if she were watching herself from far away. She said she thought excluding me would prevent drama, that she believed I would understand. Hearing that, something inside me settled, not because it made things better, but because it confirmed what I had always suspected. My feelings had been considered inconvenient, not important. I asked her if she had ever once asked herself how it might feel to be erased. She didn't answer directly. She said she had been overwhelmed. My father cleared his throat and said, "Families make mistakes." That phrase, so general and forgiving, landed like a dismissal. I told him that mistakes are usually followed by apologies. Again, silence. This time it felt different, less heavy, more honest. I realized then that this conversation was not going to give me the closure I once imagined. They were not suddenly going to transform into people capable of deep self-reflection. What they could offer was limited, and I had to decide whether that was enough. I told them I would help with part of the medical expenses, not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want to become someone hardened by resentment. I was clear, though, this was not a reset. This was not forgiveness wrapped in a check. It was a boundary. My sister nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. My parents thanked me, their voices thick with emotion. I felt oddly detached, like I was watching someone else make the decision. Over the next months, I transferred the money. I received updates about treatments, bills, setbacks. I responded politely, briefly. I didn't visit often. When I did, I kept my distance. I noticed how my presence still shifted the room, how conversations adjusted around me. I was no longer invisible, but I wasn't fully included either. It was a strange, liminal place to exist. During this time, I learned something about absence. When you leave quietly, people don't always notice right away, but when you return changed, they sense it immediately. My sister recovered slowly. Life, in many ways, went back to normal for them. Invitations started coming again, casual ones, a dinner, a holiday. Each invitation felt like a test. I attended some, I declined others. I paid attention to how I felt, not how things looked. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reconciliation, just a gradual understanding that our relationship had permanently shifted. One afternoon, my mother called and asked why I seemed distant. I told her the truth, that I was still standing where they left me years ago, and that it takes time to walk back from that. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she didn't know how to fix it. That honesty, small as it was, mattered. I told her I wasn't sure it could be fixed, only managed. Over time, the calls became less frequent, not out of anger, but acceptance. I stopped expecting them to become the family I once wanted. In doing so, I felt lighter. I spent more time with friends who chose me openly. I built traditions that didn't revolve around obligation. Occasionally, I would think back to that wedding and feel a dull ache, but it no longer defined me. One evening, years later, I attended another wedding, a friend's. When the photographer called for family and close friends, my friend pulled me in without hesitation. No pause, no question. I felt something in my chest loosen, just a little. That's when I understood the real lesson of being disowned quietly. It teaches you the value of being chosen loudly. I didn't walk away from my family in anger. I walked forward into a life where my presence wasn't negotiable. And that, more than revenge or forgiveness, gave me peace. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of confusion. After everything settled, after the crisis passed and the urgency faded from my family's voices, what remained was clarity. I no longer wondered where I stood. I knew. That knowledge reshaped the way I moved through the world. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. With my family, interactions became measured, intentional. I was present when I chose to be, not because I was expected to fill a role. My parents tried in their own limited way to bridge the distance. My mother sent messages about small things, recipes she remembered I liked, news from neighbors I barely remembered. Sometimes I replied, sometimes I didn't. Each choice felt deliberate rather than reactive. That difference mattered. My sister and I spoke occasionally, mostly about surface-level topics. Her gratitude lingered in the background, unspoken but evident. Yet there was also something else, a quiet discomfort. I sensed she knew something fundamental had changed and that it couldn't be undone by polite conversation. Once, during a family dinner I decided to attend, she pulled me aside and asked if I was still angry. The question surprised me. I realized then how often people mistake boundaries for bitterness. I told her I wasn't angry. I was careful. She didn't seem to understand the difference. Over time, I noticed how family gatherings subtly adjusted around me. I was no longer pushed aside, but neither was I centered. I existed on the edge, acknowledged but not leaned on. And strangely, I was okay with that. Being erased had taught me the cost of invisibility, but it had also taught me the freedom of not performing for acceptance. Outside of my family, my life continued to expand. I took on projects that scared me. I formed relationships rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. When people asked about my family, I answered honestly, but without drama. I had learned that telling the truth quietly often carries more weight than telling it loudly. There were moments, though, when grief surfaced unexpectedly. A song, a holiday, the smell of certain foods. Loss doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. On those days, I allowed myself to feel it without judgment. I didn't rush to forgive or forget. I let the feeling pass on its own. One afternoon, my father asked to meet alone, just the two of us. We sat on a park bench, watching people walk their dogs, children run past. He looked at his hands for a long time before speaking. He said he wished he had handled things differently. That sentence, imperfect and incomplete, was the closest he had ever come to an apology. I thanked him for saying it. I didn't tell him it fixed anything. I didn't tell him it was too late. I simply accepted it for what it was, a small offering from someone who had never been good with emotional currency. As we sat there, I felt no urge to reconcile fully, no longing to return to how things were. That version of us belonged to another time, another set of expectations. When I left, I felt calm, not relieved, not triumphant, just calm. That calm became my guide. Whenever I faced decisions about my family, I asked myself whether the choice preserved that calm or disturbed it. More often than not, the answer was clear. Years after the wedding, someone new entered my life, someone who listened closely, who noticed when I withdrew, who asked thoughtful questions without prying. When I told them about my family, about the quiet disowning and the quiet return, they didn't rush to judge or fix. They said, that must have taken a lot of strength. No one had ever framed it that way before. Strength. I realized then how much of my story I had viewed through the lens of loss rather than resilience. I wasn't just someone who had been rejected. I was someone who had survived that rejection without becoming cruel. As time went on, I stopped telling myself I had been disowned. I told myself I had been redirected toward a life that asked me to define my worth internally, not through inherited roles, toward relationships that didn't require me to shrink. My family remains part of my story, but they are no longer the authors. When I think back to that wedding now, I still feel a pang, but it's softer, tempered by everything that came after. The chair that was moved taught me where I was not welcome. Life taught me where I was. And in that distinction, I found something better than belonging. I found agency. Agency changes the way you remember the past. Once you understand that you had choices all along, even when they were limited or painful, memories lose some of their power to wound. They become reference points instead of open scars. I noticed this shift most clearly the first time I declined a family invitation without rehearsing an excuse. My mother had called to say they were planning a small celebration, nothing formal, and they would like me to come. In the past, I would have weighed the request heavily, wondering what declining might signal, what it might cost. This time, I simply checked in with myself. I was tired. I wanted a quiet weekend. I told her I wouldn't be able to make it. She sounded disappointed, but she didn't press. When I hung up, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not because I had said no, but because I had done so without guilt. That was new. As months passed, my relationship with my family settled into something stable, if distant. We spoke on birthdays. We exchanged polite updates. The intensity was gone, replaced by a neutral understanding. Occasionally, someone would mention the wedding in passing, usually unintentionally. Each time, I felt a brief tightening in my chest, followed by release. The memory no longer demanded a reaction. It simply existed. I began to notice how often people stay in harmful family dynamics because they confuse endurance with loyalty. I had done that for years, believing that staying silent was a form of love. Walking away taught me otherwise. Love that requires erasure is not love, it is compliance. That realization shaped how I approached every relationship afterward. I stopped overgiving. I stopped making myself smaller to keep others comfortable. When conflict arose, I addressed it early, calmly, before resentment had time to grow roots. Not everyone appreciated this version of me. Some relationships faded, others deepened. I accepted both outcomes. One evening, my sister called unexpectedly. She said she had been thinking about the past, about the wedding, about how things unfolded afterward. Her voice wavered slightly as she admitted she had been afraid at the time, afraid of family expectations, afraid of confrontation, afraid of choosing wrong. She said excluding me had seemed easier than dealing with discomfort. Hearing her articulate that felt like opening a window in a room I had been sitting in for years. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't tell her it absolved her. I told her it helped me understand. That distinction mattered. Understanding brings clarity. Absolution requires accountability. We talked for a while longer, cautiously, honestly. When the call ended, I felt neither healed nor hurt, just steady. That steadiness became the hallmark of my life. I built routines that grounded me. Morning walks, regular check-ins with friends who had become family by choice, moments of solitude that felt nourishing rather than lonely. I learned that loneliness often comes not from being alone, but from being unseen. I was seen now, fully. Sometimes people would ask if I regretted not cutting my family off completely. The question always struck me as missing the point. This wasn't about extremes, it was about alignment. I didn't stay to prove loyalty, and I didn't leave to punish. I chose a middle path that honored my limits. That choice wasn't dramatic enough to satisfy some narratives, but it was sustainable. And sustainability, I learned, is underrated. Years later, I attended another family wedding. This time, I was included without question. My name was printed correctly. My seat was where it should be. During the reception, my father mentioned me in his speech, briefly, respectfully. People glanced at me, smiling. On the surface, it looked like a redemption arc, but inside, I felt something unexpected. Indifference. Not coldness, not bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that while things had improved, they had not erased what came before, and they didn't need to. After the wedding, as I drove home, I reflected on how far I had come. The younger version of me would have clung to that moment as proof of worth. The current version simply noted it and moved on. That difference marked the real growth. Being disowned had forced me to confront a truth many people avoid, that family, like any institution, can fail. When it does, you are allowed to adapt. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to redefine connection on your own terms. I no longer measured my life against my family's approval. I measured it against my own sense of integrity. When I lay down at night, I slept easily, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was unresolved. That, to me, felt like freedom. Freedom has a quiet sound. It doesn't announce itself with celebration or certainty. It arrives slowly, in the absence of anxiety, in the way your shoulders relax without you noticing. For me, that freedom showed up most clearly in moments when my family's reactions no longer dictated my internal weather. When my mother sounded distant on the phone, I didn't spiral. When my sister forgot to return a message, I didn't assume rejection. I had stopped filling in their silences with old fears. That space, once occupied by self-doubt, became room for other things: curiosity, patience, joy. I began mentoring someone at work, a younger colleague who reminded me of myself years earlier, eager, cautious, hungry for validation. Watching them navigate their own complicated family situation stirred something reflective in me. They asked once how I learned to set boundaries without becoming bitter. The question stayed with me. I realized bitterness often comes from unspoken expectations. I had let go of expecting my family to be different. That release wasn't resignation, it was realism. With that realism came compassion, not just for them, but for myself. I stopped revisiting old conversations in my head, imagining better outcomes. I accepted that I had done the best I could with the information and emotional tools I had at the time. That acceptance softened my internal narrative. Around this time, my father's health began to decline. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of years. My parents reached out more frequently, not for help, but for a connection. I responded as I was able. Sometimes that meant long conversations. Sometimes it meant a brief check-in. I paid attention to my capacity. I learned that being present doesn't require self-sacrifice. When my father was hospitalized briefly, I visited. Sitting beside his bed, listening to the steady beep of machines, I felt the familiar pull toward obligation, but it was tempered now by choice. I was there because I wanted to be, not because I felt I had to earn my place. He thanked me quietly. I squeezed his hand. No speeches, no reconciliation scene, just two people acknowledging a moment. Afterward, I went home and rested without guilt. That might sound small, but it marked a significant shift. In the past, family crises consumed me entirely. Now they occupied a place in my life without overtaking it. Friends noticed the change before I did. They commented on my calm, my steadiness. I realized that my story, once defined by exclusion, had evolved into one defined by discernment. I chose where to invest my energy. I chose who had access to me. Those choices created a sense of safety I had never known growing up. I also began writing, privately at first, not to document grievances, but to make sense of patterns. Writing helped me see how often silence had been used as a tool in my family, how love was expressed through practicality rather than vulnerability. Understanding this didn't excuse the harm, but it contextualized it. It allowed me to hold two truths at once. They had hurt me deeply, and they had done so within their own limitations. Holding both truths required maturity I hadn't had before the wedding. Growth, I learned, is rarely linear. There were setbacks, days when an offhand comment reopened old wounds, moments when I felt that familiar urge to withdraw completely. But I responded differently now. I named the feeling, I gave it space, then I chose my response deliberately. That process, repeated over time, built trust within myself. Perhaps the most surprising change was how I spoke about family to others. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices or defend my boundaries. I simply stated them. The people who respected that stayed. The ones who didn't drifted away. That filtering effect brought clarity to my relationships. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I realized I no longer needed my family to validate my pain for it to be real. That realization felt like setting down a heavy bag I had been carrying for years. Validation had come from within, slowly, earned through consistent self-respect. When I thought back to the wedding now, I could see it not just as an ending, but also a beginning. A painful one, yes, but also catalytic. It forced me to confront who I was when stripped of familiar roles. It compelled me to build a self that could stand independently. That self, once formed, became the foundation for everything that followed. I didn't emerge unscathed, but I emerged intact, and that distinction matters. Intact doesn't mean untouched. It means the core remains whole, even after pressure, even after fracture. I came to understand that distinction more deeply as time moved on and my life continued to expand in ways I never could have predicted during those quiet, lonely years after the wedding. There were moments when my family drifted further into the background of my daily life, not because of conflict, but because they were no longer central to my sense of self. That shift felt both liberating and strange. Family had once been the axis around which everything turned, even when it hurt. Now it was one influence among many. I noticed how my reactions to their choices softened. When my sister made decisions I didn't agree with, I didn't feel personally slighted. When my parents expressed opinions shaped by their generation, I didn't feel compelled to correct them. Distance, emotional and physical, had given me perspective. I could see them more clearly, flaws and all, without needing them to be different. That clarity extended inward as well. I examined my own patterns, the ways I had internalized silence as safety. I saw how often I had avoided expressing needs to prevent disruption. Recognizing that allowed me to unlearn it. In relationships, I practiced speaking sooner, not louder. I asked for what I needed without apology. Sometimes the answer was no, and that was okay. The fear that no would equal abandonment had lost its grip on me. Around this time, I attended a workshop on conflict resolution for work. One exercise involved recounting a personal experience of exclusion and identifying what you would say now with the insight you have. When it was my turn, I spoke about the wedding. I described it simply, without embellishment. When asked what I would say now, I paused. I realized I wouldn't say anything to the people involved, not because I had nothing to say, but because the lesson had already been learned. The power wasn't in the words, it was in the life I built afterward. That realization surprised me. I had always assumed closure required dialogue. Sometimes it requires direction instead. My family continued to reach out intermittently. Holidays brought polite messages, occasional updates filtered through. There was no return to closeness, but there was a functional peace. I accepted it as such. One year, my mother sent a message saying she wished things were different. I read it several times. I believed her. I also understood that wishing doesn't automatically translate into change. I responded kindly without reopening old wounds. Kindness, I had learned, doesn't require self-betrayal. It requires intention. As my life stabilized, I found myself becoming a quiet advocate for people navigating similar family dynamics. Friends confided in me, colleagues asked for advice. I never positioned myself as an expert. I simply shared my experience honestly. I told them that walking away doesn't always mean leaving forever, and staying doesn't always mean enduring harm. There are options between extremes. Hearing others find comfort in that nuance reinforced my own choices. One evening, years after everything began, I stood in my kitchen preparing a meal, music playing softly in the background. The moment felt ordinary, unremarkable, and that's when it hit me. This was what I had been working toward all along. Not reconciliation, not vindication, normalcy. A life not dominated by old pain. That normalcy felt like an achievement. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how bitterness could have hardened me, how desperation for approval could have led me back into patterns of self-erasure. I had chosen another path, not perfectly, but consistently. That consistency mattered more than any single decision. Occasionally, I wondered what my family told themselves about our story. Did they see it as a misunderstanding, a mutual drifting, a necessary sacrifice? I realized it didn't matter. My truth didn't depend on their narrative. That detachment felt like the final step in my evolution. When I imagined my younger self sitting at the back of that wedding reception, watching life unfold without them, I felt a surge of compassion, not pity, respect. They endured something quietly, without knowing it would eventually lead them here. If I could speak to them now, I wouldn't promise that things get better quickly. I would promise that clarity comes with time, and that clarity brings choice. Being disowned, especially in silence, can fracture your sense of belonging, but it can also push you to build belonging deliberately, piece by piece. I built mine slowly, intentionally, and with care, and in doing so, I learned that family can be part of your life without defining your worth. That lesson stayed with me, steady and grounding, as I moved forward into whatever came next. Whatever came next, I knew I would meet it differently than I once would have. That confidence didn't come from certainty about the future, but from trust in myself. Trust that I could recognize when something no longer fit. Trust that I could leave without collapsing and stay without disappearing. Those were lessons forged slowly, through discomfort, through silence, through moments that asked more of me than I thought I could give. The story of my family didn't end with reconciliation or rupture. It settled into something quieter, something unresolved but no longer consuming, and that, I learned, is a valid ending. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old box of papers, I found the wedding program. I had kept it without realizing, folded and tucked away. I stared at it for a long time. The names were still there. Mine was still missing. Years ago, seeing that would have reopened everything. Now, it felt like looking at a photograph of someone I used to be. I didn't feel the urge to throw it away or keep it as evidence. I placed it back in the box and closed the lid. Some things don't need to be revisited to be understood. My parents grew older. Their world became smaller. Occasionally, they reached out with memories, with reflections colored by time. I listened when I could. I declined when I couldn't. I no longer measured my responses against what a good child should do. I measured them against what a whole adult could offer. That shift allowed compassion to exist without obligation. When my sister spoke about her children one day, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. Not that things would be different, but that cycles could change. I knew I would never put a child in the position of wondering whether their presence was conditional. That commitment felt like a quiet victory. I didn't announce it, I lived it. Over time, I stopped framing my experience as being disowned. That word, while accurate, held too much finality. What happened was more subtle, more insidious. I had been deprioritized, quietly set aside, treated as optional. Naming it that way helped me see how common it is, how many people carry similar stories without language for them. Silent rejection leaves fewer marks, but it cuts just as deeply. If there is a moral to my story, it isn't about choosing forgiveness or estrangement. It's about choosing awareness, about recognizing when love asks you to disappear and deciding, gently but firmly, not to comply. About understanding that walking away doesn't always mean slamming doors. Sometimes it means stepping back far enough to see clearly. I think about the moment my mother shook her head at the photographer, the small gesture that changed everything. At the time, it felt like an ending. Now, I see it as an unveiling. It showed me who they were willing to be in that moment, and it showed me who I needed to become in response. That knowledge, painful as it was, gave me direction. Today, my life is full in ways I once thought impossible, not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. I am surrounded by people who choose me openly. I choose myself daily, and my family exists in a place that no longer threatens that balance. They are part of my history, not the gatekeepers of my worth. When I share this story, I do so not to assign blame, but to offer recognition. If you've ever been present but unwanted, included but invisible, know this. The absence of acknowledgement says more about the environment than it does about you. You are not too much. You were simply in a place that couldn't hold you. Leaving that place, even quietly, can be an act of profound self-respect. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I learned. And that learning shaped a life where my presence is no longer negotiable. That, to me, is the truest form of belonging.